Hello and welcome to my channel. We have an interesting character here. This is Lloyd, portrayed by Jim Carrey in the movie Dumb and Dumber. That's the drawing that I'm going to be doing today. So a slightly larger portrait with Lloyd's head sticking out of the window of a car. I'm going to use the combination of pencils that I've been using a lot lately. The Kohinoor pencils, the soft charcoal pencil, and the silky black pencils. That's what I'm going to use for the most part. I use the charcoal pencils for the larger, darker areas, and I use the silky black pencils for some parts of the shading process and some of the details, textures, and things like that. In addition to that, I'll also use some willow charcoal and things like that. I'm going to start with the background here at the top. First, I simply went over the edge, or the top edge of his head with a charcoal pencil because I wanted that a bit darker and I didn't want it to be moved or covered once I start shading the background. Now the background here at the top is some kind of foliage, out of focus foliage, like some bushes and some trees which are behind the car. So I'm going to simplify this a little bit and just create some suggestions of the shapes of leaves and some variation in tone to make it look like there are some lighter areas and some darker areas, some shadow areas in the foliage. And then I use a brush. I clean the tip of the brush and I use the brush to gently lift up a little bit of charcoal here and there, creating some suggestions of lighter foliage which is sticking out and catching some light from the light source. So just a simple out of focus background with some trees and bushes in the back. That's all. And after that I cleaned up the edge between the roof of the car and the background because I want to have a very nice clean edge there. And then I moved on to the car itself, or at least the part of the car that is visible, the roof and the door and the window. So I'm shading this using a combination of willow charcoal and charcoal pencils, and using blending tools a lot. I normally use a combination of tortillons and brushes for blending. Sometimes I even use my fingers, but here I didn't really use my fingers that much. I will use my fingers for some of the darker bits a bit later. But anyway, I normally use either flat, harder bristle brushes or slightly softer synthetic brushes, depending on the effect I'm trying to achieve, because they all behave slightly differently. I always like to use a variety of blending tools because each and every one of them has their advantages and disadvantages, and it's somewhat difficult for me to explain how exactly all of them interact with the paper and with the material that I'm using. So these are just some of the things that you need to experiment for yourself and see what works for you. You just have to learn you have to learn to know how your tools behave, and that takes a little bit of practice. Here I used a bit of charcoal powder used by sharpening my charcoal pencils. I added a bit of that to this darker background here, the inside of the car, which is darker, and he's sticking his head out. So not much will be visible there in terms of detail. I'm just going to make that dark and simplify it a little bit. And of course clean up the edge. between the ear and the left side of the face and that background. Sometimes you have to rotate your paper quite a bit in order to get those clean edges. I try to minimize rotating, which makes my drawing process quite a bit more difficult, I have to tell you. But the thing is that when I'm recording top down, as I am now, I try not to rotate too much, so that it would be easier for you to follow along with the drawing process. But depending on the type of the drawing and the things that you're doing at the time, sometimes you may need to rotate a little bit, because you might just want to work under a different angle or something. Now I'm going to start working on the hair. Now, whenever you have straight hair, and whenever the hair is a little bit darker, and Lloyd's hair is like dark brown maybe, it's always relatively easy to do this in charcoal, especially when you have a simple haircut like this one. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put down those darker areas first using that soft charcoal pencil. And we have a darker area at the top of the dome here, and then around those cropped bangs, and then on the sides of the head near the ears. So those are some of the darker areas, while the middle area is a little bit lighter. The darker areas I'm going to blend with my finger, because when I push the charcoal in with my finger it's going to remain a bit darker. And then the rest of the blending process I'm going to do that with a brush, by pushing the charcoal gently, or maybe not so gently, from those darker areas onto the lighter areas. And that way I naturally create these soft transitions where I leave the highlights in the middle without actually having to put in too much work to create them. So I'm simply creating the lighter bit of his head or of his hair by leaving that area uncovered with charcoal, and then by shading it simply by moving the charcoal dust from the darker areas onto the lighter areas. And you can see what a nice easy transition I got, and you can do this in a matter of minutes. And if you want to reinforce those highlights, make them even more noticeable, or create a bit more contrast, you can always go back in with a pencil eraser or a kneaded eraser and create some areas of lighter value. I'm working on the ear, by the way, here, and just shading it and trying to define its shape. So you can always go back and refine the hair a little bit with an eraser, but it's usually very easy to draw darker hair with charcoal, especially if it's straight. And if it's such a simple hairstyle as this one, simple goofy hairstyle, and his expression here is also kind of goofy. He has a chipped tooth, so quite a funny character. This is a very well-known comedy movie, Dumb and Dumber. I think everybody has seen it. But just in case you haven't, maybe you should watch it. It's about two friends, Lloyd and Harry, who accidentally get involved in a series of adventures and go on a longer trip to return the money, some kind of a briefcase or something. So I'm working on the eyes now. I left a little bit of white space in the eye to create that highlight, and then I shaded the rest of the eyeball. The eyeball is a round object, so normally around the edges I will tend to shade a bit more, and it'll tend to be a little bit lighter near the middle, and the pupil is the darkest part, but I'm not really sure if you'll be able to discern the contrast between the pupil and the rest of the iris here. There is a bit of a contrast. My camera doesn't really capture some of these subtle differences, as well as some of the subtle textures. These portraits tend to be way more detailed in real life, but I guess for this type of video this will do. One of the things that I like to do with portraits is I like to lay down some of the darkest bits first, like for example some elements of the eyes and the nose, the nostrils and the mouth, and then I like to shade some of the larger areas, larger portions of the face, and then I define some of the smaller areas, work on the textures, details, highlights with erasers and things like that. For initial sketch, because people often ask me how to do this, the easiest way to do it is simply by tracing. You can use your computer screen as a sort of a light box, and you can put down some of the basic parts of the body that way. And then I like to use a combination of tracing and freehand. I just put down some of the basic proportions using the tracing method, and then I do a more elaborate sketch using freehand. But sometimes you may want to use some other methods. It really depends on how much time you have and which method you prefer. I did a bit more work around the eyes, and now I want to define the lower part of the face, the lower edge of the face, the chin and the jaw area, and I'm going to do that by drawing this shadow under the jaw. Jim Carrey has a fairly angular face, I think, with this square jaw, and this is just the initial suggestions of the shadow. I may need to make that a little bit darker later. The neck, of course, needs to be darker than the rest of the face because it's in the shadow. The face itself is kind of sticking out and is closer to the light source, so it's usually going to be lighter than the neck, which is tucked in and facing away from the light source. His mouth is also kind of interesting, especially especially the front teeth, this chipped tooth, which I think is a very important part of his character, and one of the main things you want to capture here. And his teeth are kind of sticking out a little bit. He has just a little bit of an overbite, so I'm going to shade the area under those front teeth a little bit more to make it look like they're sticking out. And then I'm going to shade the area under the lower lip and the lower lip itself. I added a bit of value over the teeth because I can't leave them completely white, because they too are tucked in a little bit, and they're going to be receiving a little bit of shadow. I'm not going to do all of the background here on the right side. I just wanted to do a little bit so that I could gauge how much value I need in the right side of the face and where the edge of the right side of the face will be. Now I'm just dragging my brush over the rest of the face and adding a bit of value to all of the face. This is one of the things that I like to do before I go in with the more detailed shading. I just use the charcoal residue and I move it around lightly with a soft brush to establish some sort of a base value or base tone on the face, and then I start working on that by using a tapered stroke and cross hatching, by adding adding a little bit more value, adding more shading as needed, and also adding a bit more texture in the process. So while I'm shading with a pencil like this, I'm actually not only just not only adding value and defining the relationship between the lighter and darker portions and defining the topography of the face, I'm also adding a bit of texture, because the pencil will always produce a little bit of texture when it interacts with the paper, and you can use that texture to create an illusion of a realistic looking skin. You don't really have to draw every single wrinkle or every single pore, every single dot. What you can do is you can allow your pencil to work for you, and then this texture that it creates, You can subdue it a little bit by using blending tools and make it a little bit smoother if you want to create a smoother skin, or you can leave a rough texture if you want a slightly more rough looking skin. But the point is that you can just use that texture that the pencil is creating to create a realistic looking skin without actually working too hard or having to put in too much work to draw realistic skin. So you will create one just as a byproduct of the shading process, if you will. There is a little bit more shadow overall on the right side of the face, so I'm gonna be shading this area of the mouth, for example, under the nose a little bit more on the right side, and the same goes for the lower lip as well as the entire right side of the face. And the dimples in his cheeks, they're very prominent, very noticeable, so I'm going to have to use a bit of darker value there, but notice how the ones on the right are way more defined than the ones on the left. That is simply a result of the light source, because this wrinkled area here in the middle is facing away from the light source. It's a little bit darker on the right than it is on the left. And that illusion, the face is a little bit asymmetrical, will often happen when you have a light source that's coming more from one side than the other. But once you finish the shading process, the face will still appear symmetrical, because the eye naturally understands some of these rules of how the objects interact with the light source. So you can see how much more value I'm putting down in this right side of the face. Adding a bit more value around the cheek area to make the cheeks and the cheekbones stand out a bit more from the rest of the face. And then making the lower part of the face a bit darker, because that's usually the case. The lower part of the face is usually a bit darker, just like the neck area is usually darker than the lower side of the face. So it all depends on how much light that part of the body is getting from above, from the light source. I felt that the texture on the neck was a little bit too rough, so I softened it a little bit with a brush. And now I'm going back in and adding more value on this right cheek area, and redoing the shadow under the jaw a little bit, and also trying to clean up some of the edges, especially the edge between that dark area on both sides of the head and the face and the head. I'm going to shade the rest of the forehead area here. I'm trying to vary the angle of my marks a little bit, just so that they don't look too uniform. I don't want to produce an ugly and artificial looking texture. I want to do a little bit of cross hatching and vary the angle a little bit, so that I can create a little bit more realistic looking texture of the skin. And whenever I feel like the texture is a little bit too much, I can just go back and soften that a bit with a brush. So once I've done a sufficient amount of work on the face, I can just move on with the right side of the background here, doing this darker area here on the right as well. Notice that whenever I want a larger dark area to remain darker, I use my finger rather than a brush. Brushes tend to move too much of the material around, and sometimes they make some of these darkest areas a little bit lighter than I initially wanted them to be. And that's why when I want an area to remain darker, I just push that push the charcoal in that area with my finger. Because of the texture of the finger and the oils of your skin, the charcoal will tend to stick and to be pushed deeper into the grain of the paper, and that's why those areas will appear a little bit darker. And then you can make transitions to the lighter areas using brushes, because they will allow for smoother blending. Here I'm using a pencil eraser to pull some highlights on the face, to create some lighter areas where some parts of the face are kind of sticking out, to make them look more three-dimensional. The pencil eraser I'm using is a Kohinoor pencil eraser. It's a soft rubber eraser in a pencil, and I'm using it also for the hair, just to make that round head a little bit more three-dimensional, to give it a bit more volume and to increase the range of value on it, because the range of value is what gives you, and the contrast is what gives you that idea of volume. I'm also softening some of those transitions between those darker areas and lighter areas, and making sure that that the overall shape of the head and the form of his hairstyle is okay. The ear on the right needs to be a lot darker because it's in the shadow. I'm still going to define some of the details in it, but I went over it with a brush, pushing a lot of charcoal over it just to make it considerably darker. Here I'm just kind of refining some parts of the face, making these the eye socket area, making it a little bit darker because I felt like it needed a bit more value, and adding a few more wrinkles around the eyes. And now I'm going to do this part of the car roof here by using a combination of willow charcoal and charcoal pencils. Again, I use charcoal pencils which are made out of compressed charcoal. I use that for darker areas, and I use willow charcoal for the lighter areas and for the softer transitions. It's easier for me to move that around and to blend that with a brush. I'm just going to add a bit more value here and some more detail to the eye, to the ear on the right, or his left ear. Just doing a bit more cleaning up around the edges and refining some parts of his hair and the head. Just to create a clean edge between the main subject and the background. If you like watching my videos, don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to give me a like and comment. Make sure you also check out my other videos, because I have lots of portraits. Now, if you want to see more content, if you want to see longer videos, if you want to watch the drawing process in real time, if you want to see full-length narrated videos with a lot more detailed explanations and things like that, you might want to go and check out my Patreon. Over there you will find a lot more content, a lot longer videos, slower videos, where you can follow along and draw along with me. And you can also contact me directly and ask me anything you want. Time to wrap things up here, because I'm just going to shade this part of the window here, and I'm going to do this with the willow charcoal and brushes. I felt that this was a little bit too light, so I added a bit of charcoal powder on top, but I initially produced a little bit too much texture, so I had to do some additional blending. There's also a little bit of shadow here on this part of the window coming from his head, and I will also need to make the glass look a bit more transparent, and I'm going to do this by taking away a bit of value here so that some of his white color can show up through the glass, and I'm doing that by dabbing this area with a cleaner brush so that it looks like the white part of the shirt is coming through. I blended this a little bit more, and I put my signature in the lower left corner, and now the drawing is done. I want to thank you for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.